Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mount. Regular viewers of this channel will have heard me talk many times, incessantly in fact, about my love of classic television from the 60s and 70s. The shows that burnt their way into my youthful imagination and fired up that imagination. I think that's an expression I've used several times. Fired up my imagination to seek out and enjoy exciting, thrilling science fiction, fantasy, horror, whatever you want to call it. Television and entertainment that isn't within the norm, which is why to this day I can't really watch soap operas, detective dramas, mundane sort of dramas. Don't have much of an appeal to me because my imagination wants something more. My imagination wants to be challenged. And I was brought up in the 60s on Doctor Who, Batman, the Jerry Anderson shows, Thunderbird, Stingray, Captain Scarlet, the American adventure shows, Star Trek, Land of the Giants, Lost in Space, The Time Tunnel, and a raft of British-made series, a lot of them on ITV, surprisingly, things like Freewheelers, Ace of Wands, which I've spoken a lot about recently, The Tomorrow People, and so many others, which just probed at my imagination and just got me thinking and got my mind racing, absorbing these great, intelligent, imaginative stories. One show which I've not spoken about on this channel for a very particular reason, I really wanted to do it justice, is a show which I will say stands right up there with Doctor Who as one of the prime shows in appealing to my youthful imagination, particularly because it dealt with issues around time travel. And that is a fascinating science fiction concept which writers and directors and filmmakers and TV makers have gone back to again and again and again. The idea of being able to travel back in time or travel forward in time, right, with incredible narrative possibilities. And for me, the show that did it more justice than most was one that screened between September 1970 and March 1971. It's a series that ran for 26 episodes, an unthinkable length of a drama series in this day and age. It's called Timeslip, and I'm going to talk about Timeslip today. So join me, and it stars Liz and Simon, as we go through the time barrier and into adventure. Hello, yes, Timeslip. Now, as I've mentioned a couple of times in recent videos, I'm going to do a retrospective on Timeslip today. I'm going to talk about the show. I'm going to talk broadly about how it came to be and its history, what happened and its after image and so on. But I want to try and focus it more on my own personal memories of it and watching it and the impact that it had on me. Now, as I've said, it is one of those shows which is right at the forefront of those shows that embedded my love of science fiction into me, which remains, to this day. I will always seek out shows which have a fantasy bent or a fantasy angle rather than a traditional detective show or thriller or psychological drama. Just works more for me. Timeslip arrived on TV on the 28th of September 1970. I remember, as somebody who's a fan of children's adventure series, I watched a lot of stuff that had been shown during the 60s and has long since been forgotten. Things like The Master, not that Master, Orlando, shows which aren't really represented much in the archives anymore, not going to be screened anymore, but shows that I watched because they were adventurous, they were exciting, they had characters I was interested in, and they had exciting adventures, and that's the thrust of what I wanted as a kid. So Timeslip came along towards the end of 1970, and I didn't know anything about it. I wasn't aware it was coming. At the time, I was a kid, TV shows arrived, you didn't get all the pre-screening buzz that you get these days on the internet. We very often know about TV shows and films years before they actually arrive. So this show just arrived on 28th of September 1970. Because I loved time travel already, I was interested in stuff like that, I decided to watch it, and I was completely, instantly captivated by this extraordinarily adult children's science fiction series. Across its run, Timeslip famously dealt with any number of issues which, at the time, 99% of people weren't aware of, scientific concepts that were way ahead of their time. It dealt with issues like cloning, global warming, cryonics, the quest to improve the self through the use of machine technology. These are things that we take for granted today. These are things that are the stuff of Charlie Brooker's Black Mirror. And this was all being addressed in a low-budgeted children's series that was generated really just to fill a requirement for more children's television. The show came about, it appears from the research that I've done, and ironically, I think it came about really largely because of the falling out of favour of Gerry Anderson's Super Marionation shows. Gerry and his wife Sylvia were keen to move on to live action productions. They'd already done one live action film that hadn't done very well, and they were in the process of putting together UFO, their first proper live action science fiction series. The ITV children's schedule had for years been bulked up by repeats of the old Anderson shows going way back to the early 60s. Fireball XL5, Stingray, Thunderbirds, Captain Scarlet. These shows were all being churned around again and again to fill what was called the children's slot on ITV, which was sort of randomly between 4:30, 5:30, 6:15. There was very little in the way of new drama production, and this is something that was particularly noticed in 1968, when it became apparent that there was not a lot of original children's drama being commissioned by ITV or the ITV franchises. This was at a time years before ITV became this big homogenized blob which it is today. ITV now is a network that has a schedule that just rolls out all over the country. But back in the early days of ITV, and up until about the 1980s, 1990s, ITV was split into regions. You'd have different regions across the country. You'd have Yorkshire, you'd have Granada, which did Coronation Street. You had ATV in the Midlands, you had HTV or Harlech TV in Wales and the West, Southern TV, Anglia Television in Norwich. And these channels all made their own productions, which then vied for positions on the broader ITV network. And very often they would buy certain shows, they wouldn't show certain shows at the same time, they would show them at different times. It wasn't homogenized and bland as it is these days. You'd often get variations across the network. The main evening schedule would be much the same, but all the outlier slots would be slightly different. Children's television was in a bit of a ghetto, really. It had fallen behind in showing lots of repeats of old Irwin Allen shows and, as I mentioned, the Gerry Anderson shows. And there was a drive to create more original homegrown drama for children. ATV in the Midlands helped to take up the slack, and Ruth Boswell, who was a script editor at ATV at the time, fell upon the idea of doing a science fiction serial, a 6-part science fiction serial for children. She was aware of the continuing popularity of Doctor Who, which at this point was about to transition from Patrick Troughton into John Pertwee in colour. But she didn't want to do something like that. She didn't want to do fantasy monsters. Didn't really interest her. She wanted to do something which had a bit more of a scientific background, was a bit more relatable, about real people today. She developed the format for a series with her husband James. The development was instigated by producer at ATV, Renee Goddard, who was looking for something that could challenge Doctor Who, but didn't necessarily operate in the same parameters. The responsibility for scripting the series fell to a New Zealand writer, former actor called Bruce Stewart, and he constructed the plot and the general storyline of what was to be the first 6-part serial, The Wrong End of Time. The series went into development in late 1969 and went into production in May 1970. The series, for those who've not seen it, and you really should try and find it if you can, because it is still, to this day, extraordinary piece of storytelling. It concerns the Skinner family, who were on holiday in a picture postcard village called St. Oswald, which I think was sort of supposed to be situated around Rutland. Father Frank Skinner, no, not that one, played by Derek Benfield. The mother, Jean, played by Iris Russell. And their young daughter, Liz, played by newcomer Cheryl Burfield. They were on holiday with Simon Randall. He was played by Spencer Banks, and he was the son of Frank Skinner's best friend. Simon's mother had recently died. He was a very bookish, sort of owlish, studious boy, and his head was frequently buried in books. And they're on holiday together. The series starts off with a sequence which is catnip to a young imaginative mind, certainly in 1970. We see a young girl stumbling through a field. We see a sign that says Ministry of Defence, keep out. In the background there are some ruined, crumbling outpost-type buildings. And this girl is walking blindly into nowhere. She's just wandering across the field. She's watched by a local layabout who's drinking a bottle of beer in a nearby hillock. And he watches as this girl wanders across the field towards the old ruined fence post, which is part of the security barrier of this original building. He calls out to her. Her name is Sarah. She drops to her knees, her hands in front of him. She suddenly disappears into thin air alongside these fence posts. This bloke can't believe what he's seen. He runs back to the village. We meet the Skinner family now, enjoying their holiday. Liz is encouraged to try and bring Simon out of himself, so she persuades him to go for a run in the nearby fields, which of course takes them to the Ministry of Defence building. They too encounter the strange phenomenon that seems to have devoured Sarah, and they too disappear into thin air. Back at the local pub where the Skinner family are staying, they meet up with Commander Trainer, played by the brilliant theatre and TV actor Dennis Quilly. A real coup casting him for a role in this children's series, not something he'd ever done before. He's interested in what's going on at St. Oswald. He's fascinated by the story of this disappearing girl. He makes a casual acquaintance of Jean and Frank Skinner. No, not that Frank Skinner. It soon becomes apparent that Liz and Simon have disappeared somewhere, and we discover that they are suddenly in 1940. The naval base building is no longer ruined and derelict. It's night, and they are captured and taken into the building, where they meet the commander of the building, who is a younger version of Commander Trainer. Simon, the more rational of the two, Liz is a little bit hysterical, it has to be said. He rationalises that somehow they've gone back in time to 1940. The situation is exacerbated by the arrival of a raiding party of Germans, led by the urbane and intellectual Gottfried. One of the great strengths of the show, which becomes apparent particularly in the wrong end of time, are the sequences between Gottfried, played by Sandor Ellis, and Commander Trainer at the naval station, played of course Dennis Quilly again. In amongst all the usual stuff about escaping and getting recaptured and hiding for the Germans and trying to hide from the Germans what's going on in the naval station, and the interesting concept about if Liz or Simon are injured in the 40s, are they injured in the real world in the 70s? Because are they really there? Are they projections? Are they visitors? Do they have any reality in the 1940s? And this is addressed particularly in one sequence where Liz appears to be shot, and we see the quality of the scripting in these really interesting academic and intellectual conversations between Gottfried and Trainer, two men of peace who are forced into a war because their two countries are at war. They don't want to be at war. They're men who have studied, and they're learned men. And it's interesting to see a German commandant or commander of a mission depicted this way. He's not just a Nazi thug. He's a thinking man. He's rational. He understands what war means. He understands what war brings. And he and Trainer have a couple of scenes where they have these really interesting adult debates about these slightly esoteric matters for a children's program. Also on the base is a young Frank Skinner. No, not that one! Played by Don Alkin. It turns out that he is Liz's father. Now, interestingly, an earlier plot point has been that Liz's father has brought the family back to St. Oswald because he was stationed there during the war. But he can't remember why he was invalided out. Something happened when he was there. Trainer himself realises that Skinner was at the station, and he's quite keen to find out what happened as well, for reasons tied in with events happening apparently simultaneously in 1940. And this is the core of this first 6-part serial that sees Liz and Simon trapped in 1940. Liz has a sort of a telepathic communication with her mother back in 1970. She's sort of aware that something's going on with Liz. She sees visions of what's happening. And Liz and Simon, obviously they want to get out of this station. The station is being commandeered by Germans because it's actually doing research into laser technology, and the Germans are quite keen to get their hands on that. This is really intelligent, thought-provoking, and really well-made stuff for a low-budget children's series, largely studio-based. The concepts are incredible for somebody interested in time travel. The series opened up with an introduction by the then ITV science correspondent Peter Fairley, who gave the series a sort of cachet by introducing it and exploring the idea of travelling through time and having the ability to sense past events. And that was the initial concept of the series. Liz, Simon, and young minds that had been untainted by cynicism and adulthood, they could sense events that had happened in the past where something traumatic or important had happened. They could sense those events and travel back into them. It's a little bit muddied because it's first of all suggested that Liz and Simon are actually hallucinating 1940 when they clearly are physically actually there. But as the series moves on, it creates the theory of bubbles of time that certain people have the ability to move into and travel back and forth along the timelines. That first 6-part serial, The Wrong End of Time, is still to this day, and I watched it not so long ago, still a terrific piece of drama. And it's not made like children's drama. Most children's dramas star kids having adventures. I'm thinking of the Double Deckers. The Tomorrow People were kids, although they were kids who were distanced from adulthood by the fact that they had extraordinary powers. Here, Liz, Simon, and to a degree Sarah, the first girl who goes through the time barrier, they are children who are sensitive to this existence of this strange phenomenon in the ministry field. The rest of the cast are adults, and as I say, we've got great actors like Derek Benfield, Iris Russell, Royston Tickner, and the brilliant Dennis Quilley, who, as I said, was such a coup to get him in a series of this nature. And the whole idea of weaving it together with the mystery about what happened to Frank in the 1940s is part of the intrigue that keeps us going back to it, thinking, well, this is Frank, this is Liz's father, what happens to him? And we find out what happens to him. And it's very clever, very intelligent, and very rational. I have to, at this point, I think, mention the two lead actors, Spencer Banks and Cheryl Burfield, the two youngsters tasked with carrying this, what turned out to be an almost year-long production. They were relative newcomers. I think Spencer had done some TV work. Cheryl had done a little bit of TV work, but they were both new, fresh faces, which is exactly what Ruth Boswell, the script editor of the show, wanted. And also particularly the director, John Cooper, who didn't relish the thought of working with youngsters because he felt that that would create all sorts of problems. But he, like the audience, were caught up by the acting of these two. They were great. They played these young children who were totally out of their depth. Simon, the rational, science-minded one. Liz, I suppose a typical 1970s young girl, and she was very young for her age. Cheryl Burfield, who plays Liz, she was 17 making the programme, but they made her look a bit younger. I think she was supposed to be 13. Then they aged her up to 15 because it was, shall we say, visually obvious that she wasn't a 13-year-old. But she played that part very well, of this girl who was very family-oriented. It was all mummy, daddy. Some might find Cheryl's performance a little shrill in early episodes, but that's just reflecting the age and reflecting the nature of the character. She was a home girl. She loved her parents. She wanted to be with her parents, and she was totally, completely out of her depth in this time travel scenario. Originally, Timeslip was supposed to run for 6 episodes. It was quickly extended to 13 episodes and then extended on to 26 episodes. And of course, it hadn't been envisaged to run that long. So the creators had to really up their game and work fast to come up with more storylines that would keep the show going, because it was proving popular with a young audience. The first series ended, and this is where I think I bring in my first main memory of the series, having been entranced by the time travel machinations of the wrong end of time. That first story ended with episode 6, with Liz and Simon escaping from the naval base, clambering through the time barrier, and suddenly they were in a frozen Antarctic-type landscape with howling winds, ice, snow, a studio-based sort of scenario, admittedly, but for a young audience watching it, for a young mind watching it, this blew me away because I didn't know what was coming. I didn't know if the series was going to end. I didn't know what was happening next. But to see them escaping from this one location, and suddenly they're in this wilderness, this frozen, icy wilderness, where they're immediately incapacitated, but just blew my mind. And I can remember I can genuinely remember this, almost falling off my chair watching this, because I wasn't expecting this. I don't know what I was expecting, to be honest, but I certainly wasn't expecting that. And I was like, wow. And it's great to have those memories of those sorts of reactions. The second story was another 6-part story, again written by Bruce Stewart, now directed by Peter Jeffries. This was called The Time of the Icebox. This postulated a slightly different idea. Liz and Simon, having travelled to Antarctica, find themselves in a projection of a possible 1990s sort of multiverse type situation, really, where they're at a scientific establishment called the Icebox, which is in Antarctica. It's high-tech, it's the stuff of science fiction, really, computer banks, spinning computer reels, people in glossy silver costumes, but again grounded with that ineffable sense of reality that Timeslip managed with its characters. Being rescued by Dr. Bukov, one of the scientists in the Icebox, Liz and Simon discover where they are and what's happened, that they've gone into the future, a possible future. And again, the show works on the family dynamic here, because here Liz meets up with a character called Beth, played by actress Mary Preston. She is Liz of the future. She's much more scientifically minded here. Liz also meets her mother, Jean, an older version of her, again played by Iris Russell, and the story transpires that their father had been taken seriously ill, and they later discover that he is in the Icebox as well, in a sense. The Icebox is experimenting on HA57 longevity drug, which it's hoped will increase people's lifespans. again, it's quite a Black Mirror idea of people having extended life. The sort of thing that Charlie Brooker would do 40 years later, here in a children's series in 1970. But behind the scenes, there's a man called Morgan C. Devereaux, played by the great John Barron. He's this very machine-like director of the Icebox who speaks in a staccato way, and he's very single-minded about the development of this drug. But there's something more going on behind Devereaux, as we discover, as Simon in particular is fascinated by this man's fierce intellect and his intelligence, and he discovers a little bit more about Devereaux. One of the most memorable images, and still quite haunting and terrifying from the time of the Icebox, is a sequence involving the likeable and rather jolly Dr. Edith Joynton, played by Peggy Thorpe Bates. She's one of the technicians working at the Icebox, and she's very matronly towards Liz and Simon. She's a cuddly figure that we really warm to. There's a shocking end sequence to one of the Timebox episodes where her dosage of HA57, because in the story it's suggested that she's about 100 years old, well, she doesn't look it. There's a problem with her dosage of the longevity drug, and it backfires and she collapses and she's found wizened and weathered. And it's a striking image, a horrific image, worthy of anything that Doctor Who was doing in the 60s and 70s, of this really likeable character that we've grown to love over a couple of episodes and really feel warm and safe with, having this painful and unpleasant death at the end of an episode. As the series wears on, the children are able to move back and forth from the time barrier. They come back to the modern times, then they go back to the future, as it were. But when the Icebox story comes to its end and the Icebox sort of falls apart for various reasons, the pair find themselves in another possible 1990s future. And the idea is here that these bubbles are all creating possibilities of what the future might be, depending on the various decisions that Liz and Simon make as they grow older. The original idea, in fact, that Bruce Stewart postulated at the end of the Wrong End of Time, when it was proposed that Timeslip would be a 6-part series, that Liz and Simon would emerge from the time barrier older and thus lose the ability to travel back through time. But of course, when the series was extended, that idea was abandoned because that would mean the end of the series. Hello and welcome back. I think at this point it seems an apposite moment to take a break, not a commercial break because we're not on ITV, but just to take a break in my look at Timeslip, because we're halfway through the series. The whole video on the series runs for about 50 minutes, which I think is a little bit long, to be honest. So I thought I'd pause it here at the end of episode, or end of serial 2, the Time of the Icebox, and return to the series in part 2, which will be coming up very, very soon, when I'll be taking a look at the Year of the Burn-Up and the final serial which brought the series to a close, The Day of the Clone. So I will see you very soon. If you've enjoyed this part of the video, please remember to like and subscribe to the channel. That would be fantastic. Leave a comment down below if you have any memories of Timeslip, or if you're interested in finding out more. Part 2 will arrive the next day or so. So until I see you then, keep taking the stuff.